Corporate finance executive Richard Blackstone arrived at the exclusive Sky Tower Club on the 95th floor, expecting another routine business dinner with potential investors. The private dining room overlooked Manhattan from breathtaking heights, where only the city's most powerful leaders gathered. When waiter Michael Santos approached to take his order, Richard barely glanced up from his phone. "Finally, someone who looks like they might actually understand service standards," Richard said with obvious condescension. "I hope you realize that the people in this room control more wealth than some small countries. One mistake could cost you more than just this job." Michael smiled politely and began to respond, but Richard cut him off with a dismissive laugh. "Save the pleasantries. Just bring what I ordered and try not to embarrass yourself in front of real professionals." What Richard didn't know was that Michael Santos was the former CEO of Santos Global Industries, who had built and sold a $12 billion empire before choosing to work incognito among service workers to understand business from every perspective. More importantly, tonight's dinner included potential investors who would soon discover exactly who was serving their wine. If this story resonates with you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. The Sky Tower Club occupied the top 3 floors of Manhattan's newest architectural masterpiece, a gleaming spire of steel and glass that pierced the clouds 97 stories above the bustling streets below. The exclusive private club represented the absolute pinnacle of luxury dining and business networking, accessible only to corporate leaders, government officials, and international dignitaries whose combined wealth exceeded the gross domestic product of most developed nations. The club's main dining room featured floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic views of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens that stretched to the horizon, while the interior showcased imported Italian marble, hand-blown Venetian glass chandeliers, and furniture crafted by the world's most renowned artisans. Every detail had been designed to communicate absolute power, unlimited resources, and exclusive access to the financial and political networks that controlled global markets. Richard Blackstone had reserved the private Apex dining room for what he considered the most important business meeting of his career, a dinner with potential investors from sovereign wealth funds, pension systems, and family offices that managed over $2 trillion in combined assets. At 45 years old, Richard served as managing director of Blackstone Capital Management, one of Wall Street's most aggressive investment firms specializing in leveraged buyouts, corporate restructuring, and hostile takeovers that had generated enormous profits for wealthy clients while devastating communities and destroying jobs. The evening's agenda included presentations about his firm's latest acquisition targets, including healthcare systems, manufacturing companies, and technology startups that could be purchased, stripped of assets, and sold for massive profits that would enrich investors while eliminating thousands of jobs and destabilizing entire industries for short-term financial gain. Richard's approach to business reflected a worldview that divided humanity into categories of financial utility, with most people classified as expendable resources whose lives and livelihoods were irrelevant compared to profit maximization and wealth accumulation for the small elite that controlled global capital markets. His treatment of service workers, employees, and anyone he considered financially irrelevant had become legendary throughout Manhattan's financial district for its cruelty, arrogance, and complete disregard for human dignity or professional courtesy that most civilized people considered basic standards for social interaction. The Sky Tower Club provided the perfect environment for Richard's demonstration of power and superiority over people he considered beneath his attention, with service staff who depended on tips and employment from wealthy members who could destroy their careers with complaints about attitude or performance that failed to meet impossibly demanding standards. Michael Santos had been working as a waiter at the Sky Tower Club for 8 months, part of what he privately considered an anthropological study of wealth, power, and the relationship between financial success and human character that had fascinated him since his retirement from active business leadership 3 years earlier. At 52 years old, Michael possessed a background that would have impressed even the most arrogant financial executives who frequented the exclusive club, though his current position as service staff concealed achievements and wealth that exceeded those of most club members who treated him as an invisible servant, whose intelligence and dignity were irrelevant to their dining experience. Michael's business career had begun in his early 20s when he founded Santos Global Industries, with borrowed money and entrepreneurial vision that transformed a small logistics company into one of America's largest international trading and manufacturing conglomerates, with operations in 47 countries and annual revenues exceeding $30 billion. The company's growth had been built on ethical business practices, employee welfare, and sustainable development that created prosperity for workers, communities, and shareholders, while maintaining environmental responsibility and social accountability that contrasted sharply with the predatory capitalism that characterized firms like Richard's Blackstone Capital Management. Michael's leadership philosophy had emphasized stakeholder capitalism that balanced profit maximization with employee welfare, community development, and environmental stewardship, creating business models that generated wealth while contributing to social progress and economic justice for working families and developing nations. His success had earned recognition as one of America's most ethical business leaders, with awards from humanitarian organizations, environmental groups, and employee advocacy organizations that celebrated his commitment to creating prosperity that benefited all stakeholders, rather than just wealthy shareholders and corporate executives. But Michael's decision to sell Santos Global Industries and retire from active business leadership had been motivated by desire to understand wealth, inequality, corporate culture, and the psychological impact of extreme wealth on human behavior and social relationships that he had observed during his decades in international business. His current position as a waiter provided perfect access to observe authentic behavior from wealthy individuals who felt comfortable displaying their true character when they assumed they were interacting with someone who lacked power, education, or social status necessary to challenge their conduct or report their behavior to consequences. The sociological research that Michael conducted during his service work involved documenting patterns of behavior among ultra-wealthy club members, analyzing their treatment of service workers, and studying the psychological mechanisms that enabled extreme wealth concentration while maintaining social stability, despite growing inequality and economic injustice. His observations had revealed disturbing patterns of dehumanization, entitlement, and moral disengagement among financial elites who had convinced themselves that their wealth justified treating other human beings as disposable resources whose suffering and exploitation were acceptable costs for maintaining luxury lifestyles and investment returns. The data that Michael collected through his service work informed academic research, policy discussions, and philanthropic initiatives that addressed wealth inequality, corporate accountability, and the social consequences of predatory capitalism that enriched elites while impoverishing communities and destabilizing democratic institutions. Tonight's dinner with Richard Blackstone and his potential investors represented a particularly valuable research opportunity, as the participants controlled enormous wealth and influence while engaging in business practices that exemplified the most destructive aspects of contemporary capitalism that Michael was studying and working to reform. The private dining room where Richard's meeting would take place featured technology systems that could provide secure communication with global financial markets, government agencies, and international partners, creating an environment where participants might reveal authentic attitudes and strategies that would normally remain concealed from public scrutiny. When Michael entered the Apex dining room carrying menus and wine lists for Richard's business dinner, he was prepared to observe and document behavior that would provide insights into the mindset and decision-making processes of financial elites whose choices affected millions of workers, families, and communities worldwide. The room's luxury appointments immediately demonstrated the wealth disparity between Richard's world and the everyday reality of working people whose lives and livelihoods were affected by investment decisions made in exclusive environments that prioritized profit over human welfare and social responsibility. Richard was reviewing financial projections and acquisition targets on multiple screens while conducting preliminary video conferences with international investors who were evaluating opportunities to participate in leveraged buyouts that would generate enormous returns through asset stripping, job elimination, and debt loading that would destroy viable companies for short-term profit maximization. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we'll be discussing opportunities to acquire undervalued assets in healthcare, manufacturing, and technology sectors, Richard was explaining to his remote audience while preparing for the in-person dinner with domestic investors who controlled pension funds and sovereign wealth resources. The business strategy involved identifying profitable companies with strong cash flows that could be purchased with borrowed money, stripped of valuable assets, loaded with unsustainable debt, and sold or bankrupted while extracting maximum value for investors who would profit from destruction of viable businesses and elimination of good-paying jobs. When Michael approached Richard's table with professional courtesy and service training that reflected his commitment to excellence despite the difficult personalities that frequented the exclusive club, he was immediately struck by the arrogant atmosphere and dismissive attitude that characterized interactions between financial elites and service workers. "Finally, someone who looks like they might actually understand service standards," Richard said, without looking up from his screens or acknowledging Michael as a human being worthy of basic courtesy or professional respect. "I hope you realize that the people in this room control more wealth than some small countries." The comment was designed to establish social hierarchy and demonstrate Richard's perceived superiority over service workers who were supposed to recognize their subordinate status and adjust their behavior accordingly to accommodate wealthy members who expected deference and subservience from anyone they considered financially irrelevant. Michael recognized Richard's behavior as typical of financial elites who used wealth displays and social intimidation to maintain psychological dominance over service workers who depended on employment and tips from club members who could destroy their careers through complaints or negative evaluations. "Good evening, Mr. Blackstone," Michael replied with professional courtesy, while preparing to take orders and observe the business discussions that would provide valuable research data about predatory investment strategies and the psychological mechanisms that enabled exploitation of workers and communities for profit maximization. But Richard interpreted Michael's professional demeanor as inadequate recognition of his importance and financial power, prompting him to escalate his demonstration of superiority over someone he considered intellectually and socially inferior to financial professionals who manage global capital markets. "One mistake could cost you more than just this job," Richard continued, while his business associates began arriving for the dinner meeting. "Service at this level requires understanding that our decisions affect global markets and international economic relationships that people like you couldn't possibly comprehend." The threat was designed to intimidate Michael while demonstrating Richard's power over service workers to business associates who were witnessing his treatment of club staff as they prepared for discussions about acquisition strategies and profit maximization techniques. Michael maintained his professional composure while recognizing that Richard's behavior provided excellent research data about how financial elites justified exploitation and dehumanization of working people through claims about intellectual superiority and economic importance that masked predatory business practices. As Michael began to respond professionally to Richard's intimidating comments, the financial executive cut him off with dismissive laughter that revealed his fundamental contempt for service workers and his assumption that they lacked intelligence or dignity worthy of consideration. "Save the pleasantries," Richard announced loudly enough for arriving business associates to hear his treatment of service staff. "Just bring what I ordered, and try not to embarrass yourself in front of real professionals who understand how wealth creation and capital allocation actually work in global markets." The explicit dismissal was designed to humiliate Michael while entertaining Richard's business associates who shared his worldview about social hierarchy and the appropriate treatment of service workers who served wealthy elites in exclusive environments designed to reinforce their sense of superiority and entitlement. What Richard didn't realize was that his arrogant treatment of Michael Santos was being observed by potential investors who were evaluating not just investment opportunities, but also Richard's character and judgment as someone they would trust to manage their institutional assets and represent their interests in complex business relationships. Dr. Patricia Williams, investment director for the California Teachers Pension Fund, had arrived early and witnessed Richard's dismissive treatment of the waiter, creating immediate concerns about his leadership qualities and ethical standards that would affect her evaluation of investment opportunities with Blackstone Capital Management. James Chen, managing partner of Chen Family Office representing Hong Kong-based wealth management clients, had also observed Richard's behavior and was comparing it to his own firm's values about respectful treatment of employees and service providers that reflected character qualities essential for trustworthy business relationships. The international investors who were participating remotely through video conference had heard Richard's arrogant comments about service staff, creating questions about his judgment and professionalism that could affect their confidence in his ability to represent their interests with appropriate dignity and ethical conduct. As Richard's business dinner continued, and additional investors arrived to observe his treatment of the waiter who was serving their exclusive gathering, the stage was set for revelations that would challenge every assumption about intelligence, success, and the relationship between wealth and human worth that characterized financial elite culture. As Richard's potential investors settled into the luxurious private dining room, his treatment of Michael escalated from dismissive comments to explicit demonstrations of power designed to establish dominance while entertaining business associates who controlled the capital resources necessary for his firm's expansion and acquisition strategies. "Waiter, I want you to understand something very clearly," Richard announced, while his business guests observed his interaction with service staff. "Tonight's discussion involves transactions worth billions of dollars that affect global markets, international trade relationships, and economic policies that determine prosperity for entire nations. Your job is to serve dinner quietly and invisibly, without interfering with conversations that you couldn't possibly understand or contribute to meaningfully." The statement was designed to humiliate Michael, while demonstrating Richard's sophistication and importance to investors who were evaluating his firm's capabilities and leadership qualities, though several business guests were uncomfortable with his public treatment of service staff that contradicted professional standards for respectful conduct. Michael continued his professional service while documenting Richard's behavior and the reactions of business associates who were witnessing systematic dehumanization of working people that characterized predatory financial culture and justified exploitation for profit maximization. Dr. Patricia Williams exchanged concerned glances with other investors who recognized that Richard's treatment of service workers reflected character problems that could affect his business judgment and ethical decision-making in situations that required trustworthy leadership and stakeholder consideration. As Richard began his formal presentation about acquisition opportunities and investment strategies, he used Michael's presence as a prop for demonstrating his analytical capabilities and understanding of economic hierarchies that justified wealth concentration and inequality. "Gentlemen and ladies, observe how efficiently our service staff performs routine tasks without requiring complex decision-making or strategic thinking," Richard said, while gesturing dismissively toward Michael. "This represents exactly the kind of human resource optimization that makes our acquisition targets so valuable for restructuring and profit enhancement." The comment revealed Richard's fundamental view of working people as expendable resources whose lives and livelihoods were irrelevant, compared to investor returns and executive compensation that justified destroying viable businesses through debt loading and asset stripping. Michael recognized Richard's commentary as typical of private equity executives who use dehumanization and economic rationalization to justify business practices that enriched wealthy investors while devastating working families and communities that depended on stable employment and local businesses. "Our latest acquisition target employs approximately 15,000 workers in manufacturing and logistics operations that could be automated or eliminated through strategic restructuring," Richard continued, while Michael served wine to business guests who were evaluating investment opportunities. "Conservative estimates suggest we could eliminate 60% of current employment while increasing operational efficiency and profit margins." The casual discussion of job elimination and community destruction revealed the psychological mechanisms that enabled financial elites to pursue profit maximization without consideration for human consequences or social responsibility that most moral people would consider essential for ethical business conduct. As Richard elaborated on his firm's strategies for maximizing investor returns through corporate restructuring and community devastation, several potential investors began expressing concerns about the social responsibility and reputational risks associated with business practices that prioritized short-term profits over stakeholder welfare. "Richard, our institution has fiduciary obligations that include environmental, social, and governance considerations," Dr. Williams interjected, while observing his continued dismissive treatment of Michael. Our investment decisions must align with values that include responsible treatment of workers and communities affected by our capital allocation decisions. But Richard interpreted concerns about social responsibility as naive sentimentality that interfered with profit maximization and competitive advantage in global capital markets, where ethical constraints were disadvantages that reduced returns for sophisticated investors. Patricia, successful wealth creation requires making difficult decisions that prioritize economic efficiency over emotional considerations, Richard replied, while signaling for Michael to refill his wine glass. Our job is generating returns for investors, not providing social services or maintaining employment for workers whose productivity doesn't justify their compensation costs. The response revealed Richard's fundamental inability to understand that sustainable business practices and stakeholder consideration could enhance rather than reduce long-term profitability while creating shared prosperity that strengthened communities and democratic institutions. As Richard's presentation continued, his treatment of Michael became increasingly explicit and designed to demonstrate his power over working people while reinforcing social hierarchies that justified wealth inequality and exploitation of vulnerable populations. Waiter, I want you to explain to my business associates why you chose service work instead of pursuing careers that require education, intelligence, or strategic thinking, Richard commanded, while positioning Michael in front of potential investors who were witnessing systematic humiliation of someone they assumed lacked power or resources to resist inappropriate treatment. The demand was designed to force Michael into self-deprecating performance that would validate Richard's assumptions about intellectual hierarchy while entertaining business guests who were supposed to appreciate demonstrations of dominance over service workers. But Richard's challenge had inadvertently created exactly the opportunity that Michael needed to reveal his true identity, while exposing Richard's ignorance and arrogance to potential investors who controlled billions in capital resources and were evaluating character as well as investment opportunities. Michael recognized that the moment had arrived to complete his research while protecting other service workers from similar abuse by demonstrating that assumptions about intelligence and capability based on job titles were often completely incorrect and potentially devastating for people who made such judgments. Mr. Blackstone, I appreciate the opportunity to address your business associates, Michael replied calmly, while preparing to reveal information that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of the evening and Richard's relationship with potential investors. I chose service work after selling Santos Global Industries for $12 billion because I wanted to understand wealth inequality and business ethics from the perspective of working people who are affected by investment decisions like those you're discussing tonight. Michael continued while Richard's face began to change as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. The silence that followed Michael's revelation was deafening as potential investors realized that Richard had been systematically humiliating and dismissing someone whose business achievements and wealth far exceeded his own accomplishments and financial resources. Dr. Patricia Williams immediately recognized the Santos Global Industries name as one of the most successful and ethically managed corporations in recent business history, while James Chen understood that Michael Santos was considered one of America's most respected business leaders and philanthropists. Additionally, Michael continued while Richard struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake, I've been documenting predatory investment strategies and their impact on working communities as part of research that informs policy discussions about wealth inequality and corporate accountability. The revelation about research created additional shock as investors realized that their conversation about job elimination and community destruction had been observed and potentially recorded by someone with credibility and influence to expose predatory business practices to public scrutiny and regulatory oversight. Richard's arrogant presentation about worker exploitation and profit maximization had been witnessed by someone whose reputation for ethical business leadership would give enormous credibility to any critique of predatory investment strategies and their impact on working families and communities. The potential investors immediately understood that their association with Richard's firm and his discriminatory behavior toward Michael could create reputational damage and regulatory scrutiny that would affect their institutional relationships and fiduciary obligations to stakeholders who expected ethical leadership and responsible investment practices. The silence in the Apex dining room stretched for nearly 30 seconds as the magnitude of Richard's mistake became apparent to everyone present, while Michael stood calmly beside the conference table where billion-dollar investment decisions were supposed to be made by people who clearly lacked basic research skills or professional judgment. Dr. Patricia Williams was the first to speak, her voice carrying the authority of someone who managed over $200 billion in institutional assets and had worked with some of the most successful business leaders in global finance. Mr. Santos, I had the privilege of studying your work at Santos Global Industries during my graduate research at Wharton, Dr. Williams said, while rising from her chair to acknowledge someone whose business achievements and ethical leadership had influenced academic curricula and policy discussions throughout the financial industry. Your stakeholder capitalism model and sustainable development initiatives have been recognized as breakthrough innovations in responsible business practice. The acknowledgement created immediate validation of Michael's identity, while highlighting the contrast between his ethical approach to wealth creation and Richard's predatory strategies that prioritized short-term profit over stakeholder welfare and social responsibility. James Chen immediately followed, with his own recognition of Michael's contributions to international business and humanitarian initiatives that had transformed global supply chains while creating economic opportunities for developing nations and marginalized communities. Mr. Santos, your work with small-scale manufacturers in Southeast Asia and Latin America created prosperity for millions of workers, while demonstrating that ethical business practices could enhance rather than reduce profitability, James added, while extending his hand in greeting to someone whose reputation commanded respect throughout international business and development communities. The investors' recognition of Michael's achievements created a stark contrast with Richard's treatment of him as an intellectually inferior service worker, exposing the profound ignorance and arrogance that had characterized his dismissive attitude toward someone whose accomplishments far exceeded his own business success. Richard remained frozen in shock as he processed the implications of having systematically insulted and humiliated one of America's most successful and respected business leaders in front of potential investors who now understood that his judgment and character were fundamentally flawed. Michael's calm demeanor and gracious response to the investors' recognition demonstrated the humility and professional courtesy that had characterized his business leadership, while highlighting the contrast with Richard's arrogant and disrespectful behavior toward service workers. "Thank you for your kind words," Michael replied to the assembled investors while maintaining his professional service role despite the revelation of his true identity. "My current work involves understanding inequality and business ethics from perspectives that are often invisible to financial leaders who make decisions affecting working communities." The explanation of his research motivation created additional respect from investors who recognized that Michael's commitment to understanding social impact demonstrated exactly the kind of stakeholder consideration and ethical leadership that their institutions required for responsible capital allocation. Angela Rodriguez, portfolio manager for the New York State Common Retirement Fund, had been quietly observing Richard's behavior throughout the evening and now understood that his treatment of Michael revealed character problems that would make him unsuitable for managing institutional assets. "Mr. Santos, your research about wealth inequality and business ethics is exactly the kind of analysis that informs our environmental, social, and governance investment criteria," Angela said, while acknowledging that Michael's work was directly relevant to institutional investment decisions that affected millions of workers and retirees. The convergence of investor recognition and research relevance created a devastating reversal of power dynamics, as Richard realized that his potential investors were showing more respect and interest in the waiter than in his acquisition strategies and profit maximization presentations. David Park, representing Korean sovereign wealth investments, had been particularly disturbed by Richard's casual discussion of job elimination and community destruction, which contradicted his government's commitment to sustainable development and social responsibility in international investment partnerships. "Mr. Santos, Would you be willing to share insights from your research about predatory investment strategies and their impact on working communities? David asked, while implicitly rejecting Richard's presentation in favor of learning from someone whose expertise and ethical credentials commanded international respect. The request for Michael's expertise rather than Richard's investment proposals created complete humiliation for the financial executive who had been confident that his wealth and position would impress potential investors and secure capital commitments for his firm's expansion plans. Michael recognized that the opportunity existed to educate investors about the human consequences of predatory business practices while exposing the psychological mechanisms that enabled exploitation and justified wealth inequality through dehumanization of working people. Predatory investment strategies typically rely on short-term thinking that extracts value from viable businesses while externalizing costs to workers, communities, and society, Michael explained, while the assembled investors listened with obvious interest to analysis that informed their fiduciary obligations and ethical responsibilities. His impromptu presentation about sustainable wealth creation, stakeholder capitalism, and responsible investment practices provided exactly the kind of sophisticated analysis and ethical framework that institutional investors needed for making decisions that balanced profit generation with social responsibility and long-term economic stability. Richard watched helplessly as his business dinner transformed into an educational seminar, led by someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior, while his potential investors asked detailed questions about research and policy recommendations that were far more sophisticated than his predatory acquisition strategies. The irony was devastating, as Richard realized that Michael's service work provided him with insights about wealth inequality and business ethics that exceeded anything that Blackstone Capital Management could offer to sophisticated investors who were increasingly focused on environmental, social, and governance criteria for responsible capital allocation. As Michael continued his impromptu presentation about ethical business practices and sustainable development, the assembled investors began discussing opportunities to collaborate with his research and philanthropic initiatives rather than investing in Richard's predatory acquisition strategies. The complete reversal of Richard's evening from confident presentation to public humiliation was witnessed by some of the most powerful investment managers in global finance, creating reputational damage that would extend far beyond the immediate embarrassment to affect his firm's ability to raise capital and attract institutional clients. Dr. Williams took the initiative to address the elephant in the room regarding Richard's behavior and its implications for his fitness as an investment manager and fiduciary representative for institutional assets. Richard, your treatment of Mr. Santos this evening raises serious concerns about your judgment and character that affect our confidence in your ability to represent institutional interests with appropriate professionalism and ethical conduct, Dr. Williams said, while articulating what all the investors were thinking about his systematic humiliation of someone they now recognized as a respected business leader. The formal criticism from a major institutional investor created immediate recognition that Richard's behavior had destroyed his credibility and eliminated any possibility for securing capital commitments from the assembled investment managers who controlled trillion-dollar asset pools. James Chen followed with additional concerns about Richard's predatory business strategies and their inconsistency with responsible investment criteria that guided institutional decision-making for pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and family offices that served stakeholders with long-term interests in sustainable economic development. Furthermore, your casual discussion of job elimination and community destruction contradicts our institution's commitment to environmental, social, and governance principles that require consideration of stakeholder impact rather than pure profit maximization, James added, while explaining why Richard's investment strategies were unsuitable for responsible institutional investors. The comprehensive rejection of both Richard's character and business approach by sophisticated investors created complete devastation of his professional reputation and firm's prospects for capital raising and institutional client development. Angela Rodriguez completed the institutional consensus by explaining how Richard's behavior and business strategies violated fiduciary obligations that required ethical leadership and stakeholder consideration for managers of public pension assets and retirement security for millions of working families. Our investment decisions must reflect values that include respectful treatment of workers and consideration for communities affected by capital allocation choices, Angela explained, while making clear that Richard's demonstrated character problems eliminated any possibility for institutional partnership or capital investment. Richard realized that his evening had transformed from anticipated triumph to complete professional catastrophe, with his behavior toward Michael creating documentation of character flaws that would spread throughout institutional investment networks and destroy his firm's reputation among sophisticated capital sources. As news of Richard's humiliation spread throughout Manhattan's financial district, the consequences extended far beyond personal embarrassment to include systematic destruction of his firm's relationships with institutional investors, corporate clients, and business partners who could not afford association with someone whose judgment and character had been so publicly exposed. The story of Blackstone Capital Management's managing director, systematically insulting and humiliating Michael Santos, became required discussion in investment committee meetings, risk management assessments, and due diligence evaluations that institutional investors conducted before allocating capital to private equity firms and investment managers. Dr. Patricia Williams shared the incident with her colleagues at the California Teachers Pension Fund, where Richard's behavior was analyzed as evidence of character problems that created unacceptable risks for institutional investments and fiduciary obligations to beneficiaries who deserved ethical leadership and responsible asset management. The pension fund's investment committee voted unanimously to blacklist Blackstone Capital Management from future investment consideration while establishing enhanced due diligence procedures that included character assessment and ethical evaluation for all external investment managers and private equity partnerships. James Chen's report to his family office clients in Hong Kong created similar reactions throughout Asian capital markets, where Richard's treatment of Michael was seen as evidence of the moral bankruptcy and cultural insensitivity that characterized predatory American financial practices that contradicted Confucian values about respectful relationships and social harmony. The Hong Kong financial community's rejection of Richard's firm created ripple effects throughout international markets as word spread about his inappropriate behavior and the ethical concerns it raised about American private equity culture and investment management standards. Angela Rodriguez's documentation of the incident informed New York State Common Retirement Fund policies that strengthened environmental, social, and governance criteria for investment manager selection, while establishing clear expectations for professional conduct and ethical behavior that eliminated firms with demonstrated character problems. The enhanced ESG standards influenced similar policy changes throughout public pension systems, sovereign wealth funds, and institutional investment networks that managed retirement security for millions of workers who deserved ethical representation and responsible capital stewardship. Within 2 weeks of the Sky Tower Club incident, Blackstone Capital Management had lost over $15 billion in committed capital as institutional investors withdrew funding commitments and terminated existing relationships rather than risk association with Richard's documented character problems and ethical failures. The capital flight accelerated as additional stories emerged about Richard's treatment of employees, service workers, and business partners throughout his career, revealing systematic patterns of arrogance and disrespect that had been concealed by wealth and professional networks until his public humiliation exposed his true character. Corporate clients, including manufacturing companies, healthcare systems, and technology startups, cancelled engagement agreements worth hundreds of millions in advisory fees as they recognized that association with Blackstone Capital Management created reputational risks that outweighed any potential benefits from financial services. The client departures created operational problems for Richard's firm, as departing companies represented significant portions of their revenue base, while their reputational damage made replacement client acquisition extremely difficult in competitive markets where character and trustworthiness were essential for business development. Richard's personal wealth suffered devastating losses as his ownership stake in Blackstone Capital Management became worthless, and his other investments faced scrutiny from partners and co-investors who were concerned about continued association with someone whose behavior created legal and reputational risks. His luxury real estate portfolio, art collection and investment accounts faced potential liquidation as business relationships dissolved and legal challenges emerged from investors, employees, and business partners who claimed financial damages from his conduct and its impact on their interests. The legal implications extended beyond financial losses to include potential securities fraud charges, as investigators examined whether Richard's character problems and judgment failures constituted misrepresentation to institutional investors who had relied on his professional competence and ethical conduct when making capital allocation decisions. Federal prosecutors and regulatory agencies began investigating whether Richard's systematic disrespect for stakeholders and predatory business practices violated fiduciary obligations and securities regulations that protected institutional investors and pension beneficiaries from unethical investment managers. Meanwhile, Michael Santos used the publicity surrounding Richard's behavior to advance policy discussions about wealth inequality, corporate accountability, and the need for enhanced oversight of predatory investment strategies that extracted wealth from viable businesses while externalizing costs to workers and communities. His research about financial industry culture and its impact on working families informed congressional hearings, regulatory proposals, and academic studies that examined the relationship between extreme wealth concentration and social stability in democratic societies. The contrast between Michael's ethical leadership and Richard's predatory business practices became a case study in business schools, ethics programs, and policy research institutes that analyzed the moral and economic consequences of different approaches to wealth creation and capital allocation. Michael's decision to work as a service worker while conducting research about inequality and business ethics inspired similar studies by other successful business leaders who recognized the need for systematic examination of wealth concentration and its effects on social cohesion and economic justice. 6 months after his public humiliation at the Sky Tower Club, Richard Blackstone faced the complete collapse of his professional career and personal wealth, forcing him to confront fundamental questions about his character, values, and the business practices that had enriched him while harming countless workers and communities. The bankruptcy proceedings for Blackstone Capital Management revealed the extent of financial damage caused by Richard's reputational destruction, with institutional investors, corporate clients, and business partners collectively withdrawing over $20 billion in assets and commitments within months of the Michael Santos incident. The firm's remaining employees faced unemployment as operations ceased, and assets were liquidated to satisfy creditor claims and legal settlements with investors who had suffered losses from Richard's conduct and its impact on firm performance and business relationships. Richard's personal bankruptcy included liquidation of his luxury properties, art collection, and investment portfolios to satisfy legal judgments and creditor claims, while leaving him with minimal assets and employment prospects that reflected his damaged reputation throughout the financial industry. The criminal prosecution for securities fraud and fiduciary violation resulted in plea negotiations that included prison time, financial penalties, and prohibition from investment management activities that prevented him from resuming his predatory business practices. During his incarceration and subsequent probation, Richard was required to complete community service with organizations that supported working families and communities affected by predatory investment strategies, providing direct exposure to the human consequences of business practices he had previously pursued without consideration for stakeholder welfare. His community service supervisor, Maria Gonzalez, was a housing counselor who helped families facing foreclosure and unemployment caused by private equity firms that had stripped assets from viable businesses while loading them with unsustainable debt that led to bankruptcy and job losses. Richard's community service provides opportunities for him to understand that investment decisions affect real people with families, mortgages, and dreams that are destroyed when profit maximization ignores human consequences, Maria explained during progress evaluations that assessed his character development and understanding of business ethics. The educational component of Richard's rehabilitation included formal coursework about stakeholder capitalism, sustainable development, and ethical business practices that provided frameworks for wealth creation that benefited workers, communities, and society, rather than extracting value through exploitation and destruction. Michael Santos's research and writing became required reading for Richard's community service and therapy programs, forcing him to confront comprehensive evidence of predatory investment impacts while learning about alternative business models that created shared prosperity through ethical leadership and stakeholder consideration. Reading Mr. Santos's research was devastating because it documented the human costs of everything I had spent my career pursuing, Richard reflected during court-mandated counseling sessions that addressed narcissistic personality disorder and empathy development. I realized that my wealth had come from destroying other people's lives and communities. The transformation process included working directly with families who had lost jobs, homes, and health insurance due to private equity acquisitions and corporate restructuring that Richard's firm had celebrated as successful wealth creation while ignoring the human devastation that resulted from their profit maximization strategies. His volunteer work at food banks, homeless shelters, and job training programs exposed him to people whose lives had been affected by predatory investment strategies while providing opportunities to contribute positively to community welfare rather than extracting wealth through exploitation and destruction. The contrast between his previous lifestyle and the reality of working families created profound psychological impact as Richard understood for the first time that his wealth had been built on suffering and injustice, that his privilege had insulated him from recognizing or acknowledging. 5 years after the Sky Tower Club incident that destroyed his career and wealth, Richard Blackstone had undergone genuine character transformation that included comprehensive understanding of business ethics and commitment to social justice that guided his new work supporting communities affected by predatory investment strategies. The Richard Blackstone Community Recovery Foundation was established with his remaining assets and ongoing contributions from his new career as a social worker and policy advocate, providing resources for communities devastated by private equity acquisitions and corporate restructuring. His foundation's programs included job training for displaced workers, housing assistance for families facing foreclosure, healthcare support for people who lost insurance through corporate restructuring, and legal aid for workers fighting wrongful termination and benefit violations. Michael Santos served as the foundation's advisory board chairman, providing strategic guidance and credibility that enhanced its effectiveness while demonstrating the possibility for authentic reconciliation and collaborative efforts to address inequality and economic injustice. The foundation's impact extended beyond direct service to include policy advocacy for enhanced oversight of private equity firms, stronger worker protections during corporate transitions, and improved corporate governance standards that required stakeholder consideration in investment decisions. Richard's personal advocacy work included testimony before congressional committees examining predatory investment practices, speaking engagements at business schools about ethics and stakeholder responsibility, and research collaboration with academic institutions studying wealth inequality and its social consequences. My treatment of Mr. Santos and my predatory business practices reflected character problems and moral blindness that my wealth and privilege had enabled, Richard frequently told audiences at ethics conferences and policy discussions. His research exposed not just my personal failings, but systematic problems with how our economy prioritizes profit over human welfare. His speaking engagements focused on the psychological mechanisms that enabled predatory business practices, the importance of character assessment in investment management, and the need for systematic changes that aligned wealth creation with social responsibility and stakeholder welfare. The business community's response to Richard's transformation was mixed, with some executives appreciating his acknowledgement of harmful practices, while others remained skeptical about authentic change and the possibility for character development following such systematic exploitation and community destruction. Michael's continued research and policy advocacy influenced national discussions about wealth inequality, corporate accountability, and the need for enhanced regulation of predatory investment strategies that extracted wealth from viable businesses while externalizing costs to workers and communities. His academic work expanded to include international comparisons of investment regulation, stakeholder capitalism models, and policy frameworks that balanced wealth creation with social responsibility and environmental sustainability in developed and developing economies. The research methodologies that Michael had pioneered through his service work became standard approaches for studying inequality, business ethics, and the social impact of financial industry practices that affected millions of workers and families worldwide. Richard's collaboration with Michael's research included data analysis about predatory investment impacts, policy recommendations for enhanced oversight and regulation, and development of alternative business models that created wealth through stakeholder benefit rather than exploitation and extraction. 10 years after the incident that transformed both their lives, Michael Santos and Richard Blackstone had created a model for addressing wealth inequality and business ethics that influenced corporate governance, investment regulation, and social policy throughout the United States and internationally. The Santos-Blackstone Initiative for Ethical Business Practices became a leading research and policy organization that developed frameworks for stakeholder capitalism, sustainable development, and responsible investment that balanced wealth creation with social responsibility and environmental stewardship. Their collaborative work influenced regulatory changes that strengthened oversight of private equity firms, enhanced worker protections during corporate transitions, and established fiduciary obligations that required consideration of stakeholder impacts in investment decisions that affected communities and working families. Business schools throughout the country incorporated their research and case studies into curricula about ethics, leadership, and stakeholder responsibility that prepared future business leaders for creating shared prosperity rather than extracting wealth through exploitation and community destruction. The transformation of Richard from predatory investor to social justice advocate became a model for rehabilitation and character development that inspired similar programs for white-collar criminals and business leaders whose practices had harmed workers and communities. Michael's decision to study inequality through service work influenced similar research by other successful business leaders who recognized the need for systematic examination of wealth concentration and its effects on social cohesion and democratic institutions. The policy changes that resulted from their collaboration included enhanced environmental, social, and governance standards for institutional investors, stronger corporate governance requirements for publicly traded companies, and improved worker protections during mergers, acquisitions, and corporate restructuring. International organizations, including the United Nations, World Bank, and International Monetary Fund, adopted elements of their stakeholder capitalism framework for development policies and investment guidelines that promoted sustainable prosperity rather than extractive wealth creation. Their memoir, From Predator to Partner, A Journey Through Wealth Ethics and Redemption, became required reading in business programs while inspiring policymakers and social justice advocates worldwide who sought models for addressing inequality and corporate accountability. The book's success led to international speaking opportunities where they shared insights about wealth inequality, business ethics, and the policy changes necessary for creating economies that served human welfare rather than concentrating wealth among financial elites. Richard's daughter Emily, who had been inspired by her father's transformation and Michael's research, completed law school and began practicing employment law, specializing in cases that protected workers from corporate abuse and predatory business practices. The next generation's commitment to social justice and worker protection ensured continuation of their collaborative efforts to address inequality while creating accountability for business leaders whose decisions affected millions of working families and communities worldwide. 15 years after their first encounter at the Sky Tower Club, the collaboration between Michael Santos and Richard Blackstone had created lasting changes in how business success was measured, how wealth was created, and how society addressed the inequality that threatened democratic institutions and social stability. The stakeholder capitalism model that emerged from their research and policy advocacy had been adopted by major corporations, institutional investors, and government agencies that recognized the need for business practices that created shared prosperity rather than concentrated wealth through exploitation and extraction. Corporate governance standards influenced by their work required boards of directors to consider stakeholder impacts, environmental consequences, and social responsibility in strategic decisions that affected workers, communities, and society, rather than focusing exclusively on shareholder returns and executive compensation. The investment industry had implemented enhanced due diligence procedures that included character assessment, ethical evaluation, and stakeholder impact analysis for managers of institutional assets who controlled retirement security for millions of working families. Employment protection policies strengthened by their advocacy provided workers with enhanced rights during corporate transitions, improved collective bargaining protections, and legal remedies for predatory business practices that violated labor standards and community welfare. The educational impact extended throughout business schools, policy programs, and leadership development initiatives that emphasized ethical decision-making and stakeholder responsibility as essential components of successful business leadership and sustainable wealth creation. International development policies influenced by their research promoted sustainable economic growth that benefited local communities rather than extractive resource exploitation that enriched foreign investors while impoverishing developing nations and their populations. Their foundation's direct service programs had assisted thousands of families affected by predatory business practices while creating models for community recovery and economic development that other organizations replicated throughout the United States and internationally. The academic research that began with Michael's service work had evolved into comprehensive analysis of wealth inequality, business ethics, and policy solutions that informed legislative debates and regulatory decisions affecting corporate accountability and worker protection. Richard's transformation from predatory investor to social justice advocate demonstrated the possibility for authentic character change and positive contribution following accountability for harmful business practices, inspiring similar rehabilitation programs for white-collar criminals and corrupt business leaders. Most importantly, their collaboration had proven that individual encounters between people from different social and economic backgrounds could create understanding, transformation, and systematic change that addressed structural inequality and promoted social justice. Michael Santos had shown that business success could be achieved through ethical practices that created shared prosperity, while Richard Blackstone had demonstrated that predatory behavior could be replaced with constructive contribution to community welfare and social progress. Their story reinforced the fundamental truth that human dignity and worth existed independently of wealth or social position, and that assumptions about intelligence and character based on job titles or economic status were often completely wrong and potentially devastating for people who made such judgments. The Sky Tower Club incident had revealed how extreme wealth could corrupt character and enable exploitation, while also demonstrating that accountability and education could create transformation and redemption for people who accepted responsibility for harmful behavior. Their legacy continued to inspire business leaders, policymakers, and social justice advocates who understood that addressing inequality required both individual character development and systematic changes in how wealth was created, distributed, and used for human welfare rather than personal aggrandizement. The enduring impact included not just policy changes and institutional reforms, but also cultural transformation that recognized the importance of stakeholder consideration, ethical leadership, and social responsibility as essential components of legitimate business success and sustainable prosperity. Epilogue. The lesson learned. The chance encounter between Michael Santos and Richard Blackstone in the Sky Tower Club's exclusive dining room had evolved far beyond individual accountability to become a catalyst for systematic examination of wealth inequality, business ethics, and the social responsibility that accompanied financial success and corporate power. Michael's decision to study inequality through service work had exposed the dehumanization and moral disengagement that enabled predatory business practices, while demonstrating that assumptions about intelligence and capability based on social position were often fundamentally incorrect and potentially harmful. Richard's transformation from arrogant predator to committed advocate had proven that character change was possible when individuals faced genuine consequences for harmful behavior while receiving education about the human impact of their decisions and alternative approaches to wealth creation. Their collaboration had created models for stakeholder capitalism, ethical business practices, and policy solutions that addressed structural inequality while promoting economic development that benefited workers, communities, and society, rather than concentrating wealth among financial elites. The lasting impact extended beyond individual transformation to include institutional changes that strengthened worker protection, enhanced corporate accountability, and aligned wealth creation with social responsibility and environmental sustainability that served human welfare rather than pure profit maximization. Most importantly, their story had demonstrated that every person deserved respect and recognition, regardless of their current position or apparent social status, and that wealth created responsibilities rather than privileges to exploit or dismiss other human beings. The Sky Tower Club had been the setting for a lesson about humility, respect, and the danger of assumptions that could destroy careers and relationships while missing opportunities for learning and growth that came from treating all people with dignity and openness to their potential contributions. Their legacy continued to inspire individuals and institutions committed to creating economies that served human flourishing rather than wealth concentration, proving that business success could be achieved through ethical practices that created shared prosperity and social progress. If this story touched you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments what part resonated most with you. Until next time.